Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series in which we take a look at low-priced commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at Strixhaven's pachyderm archeologist, Quintorius Field Historian. Before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see what commanders you can vote on in the comments for an upcoming episode. With that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Quintorius Field Historian, or Quint to his friends, is a 2/4 elephant cleric that costs 3, a red and a white, with the following text. Spirits you control gain +1/+0, and whenever one or more cards leave your graveyard, create a 3/2 red and white spirit creature token. Quint is packing a somewhat hefty cost and relatively low stats to show for it, leaving his abilities to do most of the heavy lifting for us. And in keeping with his lore, his primary ability focuses on digging things up from the past, or in this case our graveyard, and awaken spirits by doing so. Quint's second ability encourages us to focus on incremental graveyard recursion, as even if we have multiple cards leave the graveyard simultaneously, we'll only get one spirit token. So ideally, we'll want cards that can either recur themselves or others on a one-to-one basis, so we can trigger Quint as many times as possible, and then take advantage of his anthem by pumping the spirits he creates to be 4/2s so long as he sticks around. So we know that Quint wants things to leave the graveyard and that he pumps up spirits, but what build would synergize best with these qualities? A spirit tribal build would provide us with a number of spirit tribal anthems and some recursion, but I found that there simply aren't enough pieces to make this very viable. An artifact build could work, since our colors have a decent number of ways to get artifacts back from the grave into our field or hand, as well as ways to sacrifice artifacts to get them into the bin in the first place. But we have already built a commander that focuses on recursion from the grave with artifacts, specifically equipment, link on screen if you want more on this particular build. So in the end, I decided to go all in on a self-discard and creature recursion build. To support this, most of our card draw will be in the form of rummaging and looting effects, allowing us to fill our grave with cards that are capable of reanimating themselves or others, bouncing themselves or others back to hand, or being castable from the grave themselves. And for those that aren't, we'll have other means to bring them back to the hand or field to ensure they're usable again and again, growing our board state as they do so alongside our commander. And if all goes well, Quint's latest dig site will end up as our opponent's tomb, perhaps to be unearthed and put on display by some future Lorehold expedition. So now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Skipping right to the CMC2 slot, we start off with Conspiracy Theorist, Restoration Specialist, and Milliken. Conspiracy Theorist is a 2/2 that lets us pay 1 when it attacks to discard 1 and draw 1. Additionally, every time we discard, we can exile 1 of the discarded cards, then play it until end of turn, synergizing nicely with our commander and providing extra value for our rummaging and looting effects. Restoration Specialist is a 2/1 that we can pay white to sack to return an enchantment, artifact, or both from grave to hand, providing us with some decent recursion and a low CMC body we can recur itself with some of our other effects. Milliken is a 0/1 that taps for a colorless and mills us for 1 every time it does so, giving us a mana dork that sets up our graveyard, which works well for us. Reaching the end of this slot, we have a pair of white creatures with Remorseful Cleric and Knight of the White Orchid. Remorseful Cleric is a 2/1 flyer that we can sacrifice to exile all cards in target player's graveyard, giving us a cheap evasive body with excellent graveyard disruption. Knight of the White Orchid is a 2/2 first striker that puts a plane from our deck into play when it ETBs, so long as an opponent controls more lands than we do, providing us with some rare white land ramp and able to fetch us up some non-basic planes as well. Moving into the CMC3 slot, we have a trio of Firebirds with Lightning Phoenix, Flamewake Phoenix, and Phoenix of the Ash. All 3 are 2/2 hasty flyers that can recur themselves from the grave, Lightning Phoenix doing so when we deal 3 or more damage in a turn and pay a red, Flamewake Phoenix doing so in our combat step if we control a creature with power 4 or greater and pay a red, which also comes into play tapped and attacking, and Phoenix of Ash having escape for 2 and double red, exiling 3 other cards in our grave and coming back with a +1/+1 counter, actually triggering our commander twice, once with the exiled cards for the escape cost and then again when Phoenix of Ash leaves the graveyard itself. All 3 give us some evasive bodies that are capable of coming back again if we mill or discard them, synergizing perfectly well with what this deck wants to do. Some creatures that can recur others are up next with Custondi Soulcaller, Venerable Warsinger, and Salvager of Ruin. Custondi Soulcaller is a 1/2 with melee that returns a creature back to play from our grave whose CMC is equal to X or less, X being equal to Custondi Soulcaller's power, giving us a semi-reliable way of returning CMC 2/4 creatures if we're able to attack multiple opponents at once. Venerable Warsinger is a 3/3 with Vigilance and Trample that also returns creatures to play from our grave that cost X or less, X this time being equal to the amount of damage it deals to a player, for some more combat-based recursion that gets pumped up by our commander. Salvager of Ruin is a 2/1 that we can sack to return a permanent to the field from the grave if it was put there this turn, serving as a decent piece of protection and recursion for some of our more valuable cards. Following up, we have a pair of Squees with Squee the Immortal and Squee Goblin Nabob. The former being a 2-1 we can cast from the grave or exile, and the latter being a 1-1 we can return to our hand from the grave during our upkeep, both serving as recurable discard fodder to trigger our commander. Finally, we end this slot with Bygone Bishop and Burnished Heart. Bygone Bishop is a 2-3 flyer that creates a clue whenever we cast a CMC 3 or lower creature, turning our aggressively costed creatures into card draw while also possessing a decently statted evasive body. Burnished Heart is a 2-2 we can pay 3 and sack to put 2 basics from our deck into play tapped, giving us some land ramp on a body we can recur later for even more ramp. The CMC 4 slot starts us off with some more recursion with Warcry Phoenix and Trove Warden. Warcry Phoenix is a 2-2 hasty flyer that, whenever we attack with 3 or more creatures, lets us pay 2 and a red to return it to the field from the graves tapped and attacking, for some more Firebird recursion we saw earlier. Trove Warden is a 3-4 with Vigilance that exiles a card with CMC 3 or less from our graveyard whenever we play a land, returning those cards into play when it dies, allowing us to trigger our commander while it remains alive and rebuilding our board when it dies. Then we end this slot with a pair of Incarnations with Anger and Valor, both being 2-2s that have and grant a keyword so long as they're in the grave and we control the appropriate land type. Haste and a Mountain for Anger, and First Strike and a Plains for Valor, making them prime discard and mill fodder to power up our entire board from the grave. Proceeding to the CMC 5 slot, we have some more recursion with Backdraft Hellkite, Revelark, and Bishop of Rebirth. Backdraft Hellkite is a 4-4 flyer that grants all our instants and sorceries from our grave flashback until the end of the turn, the flashback cost being equal to their original CMC, providing us with some good 2-for-1 value from all our spells on a large evasive body. Revelark is a 4-3 flyer that returns 2 creatures from our grave into play with power 2 or less when it dies and can be evoked for 5 and a white, giving us a decent evasive body that can resurrect 2 smaller creatures later or an immediate res if we need it. Bishop of Rebirth is a 3-4 with Vigilance that returns a creature with CMC 3 or less from our grave to the field whenever it attacks, giving us more combat-focused creature recursion to bring back our smaller threats. Then we close out this slot with a pair of Boros cards with Balefire Liege and Hoffrey Ghostforge. Balefire Liege is a 2-4 that grants all other red creatures +1/+1 and does the same for all other white creatures as well. Additionally, it deals 3 damage to any player whenever we play a red spell and heals us for 3 whenever we play a white spell, providing us a potent anthem for our dual-colored creatures and tokens and giving us some extra utility every time we play our colored spells. Hoffrey is a 4-5 that grants all spirits +1/+1 trample and haste, in addition to exiling any non-token creature we control when they die, creating a token copy of it that gains the spirit subtype, and returning the original creature to the grave when it leaves the battlefield, synergizing well with our commander by providing us with both spirit support and a decent anthem and keywords, alongside with more graveyard-leaving shenanigans. The CMC 6 slot is up next with its single member, Sun Titan, a 6-6 with Vigilance that brings a permanent with CMC 3 or less back from the grave to the field whenever it ETBs or attacks, giving us some more reanimation that affects all permanents instead of just creatures. Finally, we come to the CMC 7 slot and our last 2 creatures with Emiria Shepherd and Yadara Wandering Monster. Emiria Shepherd is a 4-4 flyer with a landfall trigger that returns a permanent from our grave to our hand whenever we play a land, or to the battlefield if we play a plains, giving us a powerful means of recurring anything out of our bin by us simply making our land drops for turn. Yadaro is an 8-8 hasty trampler that we can cycle for 1 and a red, which then spins itself back into the deck instead of staying in the grave, unless it's the 4th plus time we're cycling it, at which point it just comes into play instead, providing some excellent synergy alongside our commander to create tokens in the early game, which will eventually become a huge beatstick in the late game. That's it for our creatures, so let's move on to our instants. Some All-Star White removal starts us off in the CMC 1 slot with Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshares, both of which exile a creature, the former allowing its controller to replace it with a tapped basic land from their deck, and the latter healing its owner equal to its power, both prices we are more than willing to pay for a single mana instant speed exile-based removal effect. The CMC 2 slot is up next with its 3 members, Abrade, Thrill of Possibility, and Boros Charm. Abrade either deals 3 damage to a creature or destroys an artifact, giving us some flexible removal to deal with front and back row threats. Thrill of Possibility simply has us discard 1 to draw 2, digging deeper into our deck while simultaneously setting up our graveyard. Boros Charm either burns a player for 4, gives all our permanents indestructible until the end of the turn, or gives target creature double strike until end of turn, giving us a wide selection of effects we can use offensively and defensively at a low cost. Finally, we reach the CMC 3 slot and our last trio of removal spells, those being Chaos Warp, Generous Gift, and Wear and Tear. Chaos Warp spins a permanent back into its owner's deck, having its owner shuffle and reveal the top card of their deck and allowing them to put it into play if it's a permanent, giving us a very flexible non-destruction removal spell that will only rarely blow up in our faces. Generous Gift destroys target permanent and gives its controller a 3/3 token, again providing us with a very flexible removal option with a relatively low downside. Wear and Tear is a split card whose wear side destroys an artifact for 1 and a red, and whose tear side destroys an enchantment for a white, giving us the option to use both effects if we pay both costs for some decent 2-for-1 removal. That's all our instants covered, so let's move on to our sorceries. The CMC 1 slot only has one member with Faithless Looting, which has us draw 2 and discard 2, and can be flashed back for 2 and a red, for more draw and graveyard setup that we can recur later. Similar effects join us in the CMC 2 slot with Tormenting Voice, Cathartic Reunion, and Thrilling Discovery. Tormenting Voice has us discard 1 and draw 2, giving us another copy of Thrill of Possibility, which we run for the same reason. Cathartic Reunion and Thrilling Discovery both have us discard 2 and draw 3, with the latter healing us for 2 before we do so, both allowing us to set up our grave and dig through our deck even faster. 2 removal spells then close out this slot with Rip Apart and Shenanigans. Rip Apart either has us deal 3 damage to a creature or planeswalker, or destroys an artifact or enchantment, making it a more flexible and slower version of Abrade, giving us enough flexibility to warrant running it despite not being at instant speed. Shenanigans simply destroys an artifact and has Dredge 1, allowing us to bring it back to hand instead of drawing a card during our draw step by milling a card, providing us with a continual artifact destruction effect that creates a token alongside our commander every time we dredge it from the bin. Moving into the CMC 3 slot, we only have 2 members with Seize the Spoils and Savini's Reclamation. Seize the Spoils has us discard 1 and draw 2, then creates us a treasure token, again giving us more self-discard and draw that we're used to by now with some additional ramp to boot. Savini's Reclamation returns target permanent with CMC 3 or less back to play from our grave, in addition to having flashback for 4 and a white and copying itself if we cast it from the grave, recurring up to 3 things over the course of the game and triggering Quint 4 times. The CMC 4 slot then brings us Reconstruct History, Illuminate History, and Throes of Chaos. Reconstruct History allows us to bring up to 1 of each of the following from the graveyard back to our hand: a artifact, a enchantment, a instant, a sorcery, and a planeswalker, and then exiles itself, usually recurring between 3 to 4 cards for us in the mid to late game. Illuminate History has us discard any number of cards from our hand to draw that many cards, then creates a 3/2 spirit token if we have 7 or more cards in our grave, giving us a flexible discard/draw effect that usually nets us a spirit token as a bonus if we have proper graveyard setup. Throes of Chaos simply has Cascade and Retrace, casting a random 3 CMC spell from our deck and being castable from the grave by pitching a land, both effects which synergize well with our relatively low curve and our commander respectively. Last in this slot we have Day of Judgment, which simply destroys all creatures for a no-nonsense board wipe at a very aggressive cost. Finally, skipping to the CMC 6 slot, we're joined by another pair of board wipes with Cleansing Nova and Austere Command. Cleansing Nova either destroys all creatures or all enchantments and artifacts, providing us with some decent flexibility to deal with all front and back row threats. Austere Command lets us select 2 of the following 4 options: destroy all artifacts, all enchantments, all creatures with CMC 3 or less, or all creatures with CMC 4 or greater, giving us a very flexible wipe that can deal with a multitude of different board states. That's it for our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. Skipping right to the CMC 2 slot, we're starting with some white enchantments with Angelic Renewal, Darksteel Mutation, and Spirit Bonds. Angelic Renewal allows us to sack it when a creature dies to bring it back into play from the grave, giving us a cheap way to recur more important creatures as they get removed. Darksteel Mutation is an aura that turns the enchanted creature into a 0/1 indestructible artifact insect with no abilities, effectively turning our opponent's commanders into paperweights for some very annoying removal that's hard to interact with. Spirit Bonds creates a 1/1 flying spirit token if we pay a white when a non-token creature ETBs under our control, and we can pay 1 a white and sack a spirit to give a non-spirit indestructible until end of turn, giving us some evasive spirits as we play and recur our creatures while giving us a means to protect key creatures from removal when needed. Then we close out this slot with the Lorehold Excavation, which mills us for 1 on our end step, healing us for 1 if the milled card is a land, and burning all our opponents for 1 if it's not. We can also pay 5 and exile a creature from our grave to create a 3/2 spirit, serving as both a good way to get cards into the grave over time and create tokens from the bodies of creatures we know we won't be able to recur. The CMC 3 slot only has a single entry with Gift of Immortality, an aura which returns the enchanted creature back to play from the grave when it dies, and then returns itself back attached to the creature on the next end step, serving as another form of keeping our important creatures alive, and triggering our commander twice when it procs if it's not attached to him, which it would then proc once. The CMC 4 slot then gives us some more recursion spells with Marshal's Anthem and Sigil of the New Dawn. Marshal's Anthem gives all our creatures +1/+1 and has multi-kicker for 1 and a white, allowing us to return a creature back to the field from the grave every time we kick it, serving as a serviceable anthem if dropped early and giving us some decent non-conditional creature reanimation if used later. Sigil of the New Dawn lets us pay 1 and a white whenever a creature goes to our graveyard from play to return it to our hand, giving us a cheap way to recur our creatures as they die with no other conditions required. The CMC 5 slot is a single entry one, with its only member being Elspeth Conquers Death, a saga whose first chapter exiles a permanent that costs 3 CMC or greater, its second chapter increasing the cost of all non-creature spells cast by our opponents by 2 until our next turn, and its final chapter returning a creature or planeswalker from the grave into play with a +1/+1 or loyalty counter, serving as a powerful removal effect and decent if slow reanimation, which we have a handful of means to bring back to be used again. Finally, reaching the CMC 6 slot, we have our last enchantment with Warstorm Surge, which has creatures deal damage equal to their power to any target when they ETB, turning both our creatures and tokens into a source of continual damage to be used both as removal and burn. That's it for our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. Some ramp starts us off in the CMC 1 slot with Soul Ring and Wayfarer's Bauble. Soul Ring simply taps for 2 colorless, so we run it because it's the best mana rock in our format. Second up is Wayfarer's Bauble, which we can pay 2, tap and sack to search for a basic land from our deck and put it into play tapped, giving us some decent land ramp on an artifact that we can recur. Then we end this slot with Bag of Holding, which exiles any cards we discard from the grave. We can pay 2 and tap to draw 1 and discard 1, or pay 4, tap and sack to return all cards exiled with Bag of Holding to our hand, providing us with the means to turn all our self-discard into additional tokens alongside our commander, and then getting those cards back to hand when we need them. The CMC 2 slot then gives us a trio of rocks to close out our artifacts, starting with Arcane Signet, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Boros Signet, which we can pay 1 and tap to generate both our colors, and finally Mind Stone, which taps for a colorless and we can pay 1, tap it and sack it to draw a card. That covers all our artifacts, and since we don't have any planeswalkers in this build, we'll move straight on to our land base. Starting with our mana lands, we have Command Tower, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Battlefield Forge, which taps for a colorless or either of our colors if we take a damage, Boros Garrison, which comes into play tapped, bounces a land back to our hand and taps for both our colors, Fury Calm Snarl, which comes into play tapped unless we reveal a plains or mountain from our hand and taps for either of our colors, Temple of Triumph, which comes into play tapped, scries 1 when it ETBs and taps for either of our colors, Lorehold Campus, which comes into play tapped, taps for either of our colors and we can pay 4 and tap it to scry 1, Alpine Meadow, which comes into play tapped, taps for both our colors and counts as both a plains and a mountain, Myriad Landscape, which taps for a colorless, comes into play tapped and we can pay 2, tap it and sack it to put 2 of the same basic land from our deck into play tapped, and finally Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both which we can tap and sack to put a basic land into play tapped from our deck. For utility lands, we're running Mistvale Plains and Ghost Quarter. Mistvale Plains counts as a plains, comes into play tapped, taps for a white, and we can pay white and tap it to return a card from our grave to the bottom of our deck if we control 2 or more white permanents, giving us a means to trigger our commander's ability from the land slot, which is much appreciated. Ghost Quarter taps for a colorless and we can tap it and sack it to destroy target land, giving its controller a basic from their deck to replace it, making it a good source of spot removal for our opponent's utility lands. Lastly, we're running 12 plains and 11 mountains as our basics to fill out our land base. Now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. This deck currently has 28 creatures including the commander, 8 instants, 14 sorceries, 9 enchantments, 6 artifacts, 0 planeswalkers, and 35 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 18 cards that return themselves or others from the grave to the field, 6 cards that return themselves or others from the grave to hand, 7 cards that exile themselves or others from the grave, 2 cards that send themselves or others back to the deck, 9 cards that have us discard, and 2 cards that self-mill us, giving us a large number of ways to get cards out of our graveyard to trigger our commander, along with reliable ways to get our cards in the graveyard in the first place. For general deck stats, we have 10 ramp sources, 12 card draw sources, 11 targeted removal sources, and 3 board wipes. Our mana curve being a bit on the lower end this time around, but still acceptable since our curve is very aggressive, while our draw removal and board wipes are at fairly typical numbers. Looking at our mana curve, we have 6 1-drops, 22 drops, 16 3-drops, 10 4-drops, 8 5-drops, 3 6-drops, and 2 7-drops, leaving us with a fairly aggressive curve that allows us to stack our graveyard and field before playing our commander in the mid-game for additional value as we recur our resources. Currently, this deck is valued at $63.27, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For some side grades, there are some additional recursion options that are worth looking at. Pilgrim of the Ages puts a land into our hand when it ETBs and can be recurred back to the hand from the bin in the late game. Return to Past Caller recurs a spirit, instant, or sorcery back to hand when it ETBs for some more spell recursion, and Rekindling Phoenix comes back from the grave at the beginning of our upkeep after it dies if its token is still around for some mana-free recursion. Since our commander will be creating lots of tokens, some token synergies would be a good addition as well. Idol of Oblivion lets us draw a card as we create tokens, along with being able to turn itself into a huge threat later. Intangible Virtue provides all our spirit tokens with a decent stat buff and vigilance to help us on our defense, and Hour of Reckoning serves as a potent board wipe that leaves all our tokens untouched. For upgrades, Karmic Guide is a good addition for its ETB creature reanimation and ease of being able to be recurred itself. Archaeomancer's Map is a spectacular ramp piece to get our lands out of our deck, then into play. And finally, Anointed Procession has us double up all our tokens creation, and Dockside Extortionist gives us heaps of treasures every time we recur it, though it will feel like we're being strong-armed at a funeral ourselves if we shell out for them. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Again, I would like to thank everyone for helping this channel reach its 300 sub milestone. Your support means a lot and this channel could not have gotten there without it. Secondly, there'll be no new deck tech next week. I'll be taking some time off to spend with my friends and family over Memorial Day weekend, so the next video will be posted on June 12th. Speaking of, as per the votes in the comments, the next Cut Rate Commander episode will be featuring Ruxa, Patient Professor, as voted by Chris Hogan, Daniel Asserkoff, Johnny Billick, Marcel VP, One Trick Tiffany, Pablo Castillo, and the Mad Chicken. Now regarding voting for a new commander, with Modern Horizons 2 being released on June 18th, I'll be releasing a new commander deck tech for a budget commander of my choice on June 19th. So instead, I'll ask you to post in the comments what budget commanders from Modern Horizons 2 you want to see a deck tech on for the new lineup on that video. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.